everybody, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Joanna Holden and I am an author of Christian fantasy as well as being an author tuber here on YouTube. My videos revolve mostly around fantasy and series and how to write them, the nuances, the frustrations, all that good stuff, as well as vlogs, journaling, my journey as I go from writing my books to publishing them. And today is a very special day for me on this channel because today marks 1 year from when I first started on YouTube. It is my 1 year author-tube-versary. I'm not sure if that's a word, but we're going to make it a word, so happy anniversary to me! And I thought I would do a very fun, very special video today while launching a new series of videos that I hope that you are going to enjoy very, very much. Two things real quickly. First, let's address the dark roots in the room. I know I need to touch up. We'll be getting there once the craziness of preparing for beta readers is over. Secondly, I have a pretty bad ear infection in this ear, which means I pretty much cannot hear anything on this side of my head, and if I talk too loud, it hurts. So the audio may be a little wonky on this video. My apologies. Hopefully, by the time we get to the next video, it'll all be gone and it'll be back to normal. Okay, so what is this special video? The point of the series is to pay homage, to delve into, to finally give some special attention to all the books I'll never write. If you've seen my notebook shelf tour video, which, you know, I looked at all these writerly notebooks that I have and all the stories that I have that I want to write someday, the count at that point for books that I was planning on writing and publishing was 22, I believe. Since then, the number has actually gone up to, I think we are over 30 now. And this is without, there was an additional series that was like 20 to 30 books. That's been cast out of the window a long time ago. But yeah, we're up to over 30 books now that I want to publish. Which means that even if I wrote a book a year from here on out, and just steadily published and wrote and all that stuff, it would still take me until I'm in my 50s. To just get through the batch of books that I have right now, and I'm continuing to come up with new ideas all the time. I'm just one of those writers. So I finally had to come to the conclusion that there were some books and series that I would need to set aside and shelve permanently in order to be able to put all of my focus and all my attention on the books that I actually planned on publishing. This was very, very hard. I'm a sentimental pack rat. I never throw anything away if it means something to me. And every single paper that I've ever written, like, you know, even lists of names, I legit have entire notebooks full of just lists of names. Because somewhere in my mind, those people are characters, which means that they're actual people in my head, and I don't throw those things away. So the idea of shelving a project permanently was like pulling out teeth, except worse. It was awful. But I finally I had to come to terms with it, and I had to be okay with it, and that is where this idea for this series came from. I wanted to be able to still share these works with the world, even though I would never be writing them into full novels and publishing them and so on and so forth. All these books are being shelved for different reasons. Some of them there just wasn't enough story, and I didn't want to take the time and energy to try and make a story where there wasn't one. Others were good enough stories, but the story was actually cliched, had already been done too many times, the characters were cliched, all that kind of stuff. For whatever reasons, I have quite a few books now that are being shelved, and while it would be fun to sit down and go through all of them in one video, I wanted to kind of drag it out a little bit, have some time to kind of just talk through each one. All of the books I'm going to be talking about are books that came out of my preteen and teenage years, because every book since I think I was about 19 are being kept. I'm still planning on publishing those. And for those of you, let me see if I can grab it without everything falling off. I actually wanted this first video to be The Count of Rontasea. I had a request for this one because this was the series that started all of my writing adventures. This was the very first set of books that I ever completed, and it was a full fantasy trilogy, and I was so proud of it for so long until I grew up, and then, you know, you learn how goofy stuff is. But I'm actually planning on turning that into a middle grade teen fantasy series later down the road. So I can't read it yet. I can't because I don't want to spoil any of it, and I don't want to talk too much about it. Like, I already talked way too much about it in the video where I unboxed this book. I don't want to spoil it. So instead of diving into that book, apologies to the person who requested it, I'm actually going to be today looking into some of my historical fiction that I wrote as a teenager. Fantasy has always been my first love. It always will be. But for many, many years, in my teen years especially, historical fiction was right up there with it. Like, I almost wanted to write that more. It was a constant tug of war in my brain between all the fantasy that I wanted to write and all the historical fiction that I want. Plus, in school I was reading history and reading papers in history and learning about all these amazing characters and real people and real events in history. So I was constantly being plagued with new ideas. That's actually where the 20 to 30 book series came from. Was I was enjoying American history so much. I was like, dang it, I want to write a whole fiction series about the history of America and about traveling, following these families that came over on these ships in the 1700s and just like followed them all the way through till, I think it was like I had it planned all the way through like the 70s or 80s. So my plan for these videos is to pick one of my unwritten masterpieces or unfinished masterpieces in most cases, and showcase it and just talk about it. Read some of the cheesy teenage writing that I did on it. Talk about the stories. Talk about the characters, talk about what I liked, what I didn't like. And yeah, it won't always be historical fiction. Sometimes it'll be fantasy. I think there's one or two science fiction that might actually be in there too. I've seen authors do this before where they shared some of their childhood or teen writing, and it's just fun. It's just fun to go back and remember and laugh at the cheesiness and get all nostalgic remembering the stories and the characters, because when you build a world, it doesn't matter how cheesy it is. Or how little you wrote on it, you still built a world. You still lived in that world for however small an amount of time. And in my personal case, I would come up with stories, I would come up with characters, and then I wouldn't actually write them. I would just play them out in my head, randomly. I would be inspired to be thinking about them. I'd have them running like a movie in my head. So I would know all the ins and outs of the stories, and I would love the characters like I had written about them, and then I would only have written maybe like one or two chapters. So some of these videos will also have more actual written material than others. Today's, I think, was going to have quite a bit of written material, but a lot of them will be more just like me talking through what happens in the series, because I didn't get a chance to write these books. Alright, and the first book that I've chosen to go over for my teenage writing is Fire and Trial by Joanna Glass, back when I was a Glass. This is a trilogy set during the Civil War, the American Civil War. I was inspired for this shortly after we moved from South Carolina up to North Carolina. I think I was about 14 or 15, I think it was 15 when I started writing this, and we had been watching for the last couple of years, just rewatching and rewatching a Civil War era drama series, where like they went all out with the costumes and they went all out with the reenactments, and they had all these amazing characters that you fell in love with, and the sets were so realistic, and it was like they actually filmed in some of these southern places and some of the northern places. And my family went crazy over this, and I went crazy over this, and I decided that I was going to write my own series about it. And the first book of the series was called Fire and Trial, which I actually think isn't a terrible name. It's probably been used a million times, but it wasn't terrible for a 15-year-old, I'm just going to say that. And I completed, let me count, 5 1/4 chapters, which is actually not too bad, given my record of usually only making one. But like I mentioned before, I had the entire series planned out. So I'm going to read a little bit from here and just kind of talk through the story as I go. But Fire and Trial, its main POV character is a 15-year-old girl from the South, of course, because I was from the South. And her name is Eloise Ryerson. She is one of the middle siblings in a family of 12, and she's not, like I mentioned, the only point of view character, but she is the lead point of view character. She was, in essence, my self-insert character. Although with her, it was less of a self-insert where it was like, you would think of a character that has no personality, as like two-dimensional. This character had actually a lot of personality. I think because I based her off of myself, I included a lot of my own personality and traits. I included a lot of my likes and dislikes. When I wrote this book, or I started writing this book, I was coming out of that weird phase between 12 and 15 where you feel terrible about yourself. You're not quite an adult, but you're not quite a kid. You want to be one of the big people, but you're too awkward to get there, and nothing you say is right, and nothing you do is right. That awful stage where you just try to survive. I was coming out of that, and so I was giving my character a lot of the same emotions that I was experiencing, but I was allowing her to step out and be a more assertive, more confident, more triumphant version of myself. So she experienced a lot of the same things and felt a lot of the same things, but she actually did something about how she felt. So I guess in a way I was sort of living vicariously through her. I intentionally would put her in some of these similar discomfortable, uncomfortable, awkward situations that I would find myself in as an awkward 15-year-old, and allow her to triumph over them differently and emerge with a different level of self-confidence than I had. There was actually supposed to be a prequel to this book. It didn't really have a title, but it basically set up the story so that Fire and Trial could really just take off and have all the background taken care of. The story takes place, for the most part, in a small town of Graceton, in, of course, the magnificent state of South Carolina, where everything got started. I lived there for 9 years of my life, so I feel like that was kind of where I felt the most comfortable. Plus, I mean, it was the heart of the Deep South, so it just kind of felt like it worked out very well. The prequel explained, it was told from the point of view of Eloise's stepmother, Charlotte Cross, who was a 29-year-old single woman who really, she didn't need a family, she didn't need anything, she was busy living life. So her second cousin invites her to come and spend a summer with them and with the family, and of course introduces her quickly to this man, and his name is, double check the sheets, Colonel John Ryerson. I think he's like retired. He fought in Spanish-American War, I think, was kind of what his backstory was. Basically, he had been in the military for a long time and then had retired as a colonel and was taking care of his family. And his wife passed away. Basically, it was The Sound of Music, but without the nuns and the singing, and the whole nanny thing. It had a lot to do with introducing us to the family, all the 12 siblings, and of course Eloise, and giving us just a really good background to the town where the story is set in, and the community, and all that sort of stuff. I never wrote that. I don't think I ever even fully had the whole story figured out, but it was the prequel to this book, and as such I felt like it was kind of important to mention. This book picks up right after that one left off, I think it was right after the Colonel and Charlotte went on their honeymoon. They got married and went on their honeymoon. So they are home, life is slowly returning to normal, or to the new normal, and our book starts off, I believe it is March of 1861. It's right before the war really breaks out. So I'm going to read, I'm not going to be reading all of this, obviously, that would make this video way too long, but I'm going to read some of the fun passages from this little bitty manuscript. Okay. So, Chapter 1. The sun was shining brightly over the entire estate of Aldenwood as Colonel John Ryerson stood by his bedroom window, overlooking the gorgeous scenery surrounding his house. One thing you'll notice is that run-on sentences were like my jam. The soft sound of rustling sheets behind him told him that his dear wife Charlotte had awakened as well. He smiled as he looked at her raven-black curls all tangled and in disarray. Her fair complexion was even whiter than usual, due to lack of exposure to the sunshine in the cold days before. Her dark eyes fluttered open and then squinted in the morning light. As quietly as he could, John approached the bed and sat down on the edge. "I declare, darling," he whispered, "I was beginning to wonder if you were alive." In a sleepy drawl, she said, "What time is it?" "Time for us both to be up and about," he replied. "I'm sorry," she said, rubbing her eyes. "I meant to be up much earlier than this." John smiled and tenderly brushed hair away from her eyes. "You've been busy the last few days," he said. "You had a right to sleep in." "But," she protested, "the children, who will—" "Miss Fisher will have taken care of them by now," her husband assured her. "Oh, that's right," Charlotte said. "I'd forgotten about Miss Fisher." I actually don't remember who Miss Fisher was, and she doesn't show up anywhere in the manuscript, so I'm assuming that she was a nanny of sorts, I'm guessing, or something like that. Where was I? There was a slight pause, during which the Colonel simply sat there, smiling at Charlotte. "What is it?" she asked, smiling suspiciously and quirking her eyebrows. In a far more serious tone of voice, her husband leaned over and whispered gently, "I love you, Charlotte." She laughed and replied jokingly, "Well, I'm glad, because I would hate to be married to someone I loved who didn't love me back." Silence ruled for a moment, and then John bent his head down and softly kissed her. She returned his kiss, and then a knock on the door woke them both to the fact that they were not alone in the world. As a mother now, I even more appreciate this scene than I did when I wrote it as a 15-year-old, just saying. Little 5-year-old Constance was just outside the door, and as soon as she heard the sound of voices within, she said in a loud whisper, "Is Mama still asleep?" "No," Charlotte replied, "I'll be out in a little while." "Thank you," the little girl said, and then ran down the hall, yelling to all her siblings that Mother was awake and they could now make noise. The couple looked at each other and laughed. "Oh, it feels so good to be called Mama," said Charlotte as she sat up. Then she realized that she had sat up far too quickly and put a hand to her head. "I'll go downstairs and see how breakfast is coming along," John said, and as he walked to the doorway, he added, when he reached it, "That is, if there's any left for us." And with the broad smile that always lit up his face, the Colonel closed the door behind him and headed off down the hall. Charlotte laughed. She knew how much her husband's son could eat. "No," she corrected herself, "they're my sons too now." As she stood up and put on her robe, she remembered the first time she had met her husband. So here we get our first glimpse into the prequel. It had been on a visit to her dear friends, the Lawrences. Okay, my mistake. They were friends, not relatives, sorry. Mrs. Lawrence was John's sister, and so the introduction had been very soon after her arrival. But John had still been recovering from the death of his beloved wife Elizabeth nearly 5 years before at the birth of Constance, their youngest, and therefore Charlotte had been very careful how she treated him. Yet they had been drawn together by the will of their Heavenly Father, and they were now a married couple, and more in love with each other than either had thought possible after such a tragedy. Charlotte had loved the idea of suddenly becoming a mother to 11 children, and had relished every moment she could spend in their company. Another apology, I thought it was 12. Sorry, I missed it. It was actually 11. The oldest, Patrick, was 25 years of age and had been married previous summer to Caroline Braddock. He now lived in Georgia, a cadet lieutenant in the Army, with his wife and infant daughter, Lucille. And they were not sure when they would be able to see them again. Charlotte sighed. It was a good thing for Patrick to be married well and settled, but she had grown to love him dearly as a son, and she missed him as much as his own mother would have. Now Brandon was the oldest in the house, but they rarely saw him either, as he, being a proud member of the Confederate Army, was now commissioned to a regiment much further south. And with Genevieve, the next oldest, being called upon by the handsome Sergeant Bailey from the local militia, who knew when it would be her turn to leave? "I feel as if I'm losing my family before I hardly get to know them all," she said aloud to the sparrow on the fence outside. "Oh, help me not to begrudge it, Lord," she added in a whispered prayer. She called a maid to help her with her clothing and hair, and then headed for the kitchen. She would not waste another minute of this beautiful day. So the next part of the story is a blip of a scene, like a little teeny tiny scene, where Charlotte, as we know, has breakfast. Nothing interesting happens. Now, after all that, we finally get to the main point of view character, Eloise Ryerson, the 15-year-old angsty teenager. I feel like I should point out at this point, there are a ton of points of view in this book. That's something that I kind of gleaned from that historical drama that we enjoyed so much, was just that there were so many points of view in that series, and that translated into my books. So I think that's kind of where I got my start in multi-POV books, was I never wanted to be limited to just one person because I felt so confining. Alright, Eloise's chapter. Here we go. We're going to get our first look at what teenage me put into a self-insert character. Let's see. Eloise looked out the window at the rain, lost among her thoughts. She couldn't understand it. Why did that Clayton White always manage to get her so unraveled? We can already see where this is going. Pretty much I was also living vicariously through her with having, and this happened in a lot of stories, where it was a main point of mine in every book to make sure that my female protagonist had as many potential love interests as possible. Not that they were all in love with her at the same time, or that she was in love with all of them at the same time, but just that, like, she had options. Again, living vicariously through her. But this book kind of takes the cake from all of them, because in this one, like, and you'll understand what I mean, but this one is kind of like the epitome of all of that writing in one chapter. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. Why did that Clayton White always manage to get her so unraveled? She couldn't find a single thing to say when she was anywhere near him, and he seemed to be so self-confident, so condescending. Of course, Nathaniel, that's her older brother, who's 17, said that Clayton wasn't really that bad once you got to know him. But then, she and Clayton rarely spoke to each other despite Nathaniel's friendship with him. So how could she truly get to know him? Turning her thoughts elsewhere, Eloise got up from the window seat and laid down on the bed. Okay, so also in this book, for some reason, I thought it was important to mention, like, her, discomfort, as a girl, if you know what I mean, with something that happens every month. That made it into this manuscript. It wasn't even a plot point. Why is it in here? Because I was 15. I didn't know any better. At least it's realistic, right? Let's just give me points for realism. I'm gonna skip this. Okay. A knock on the door announced the arrival of the maid with her afternoon tea, which her mother had said would be sent up. The girl smiled as she entered. Eloise tried to smile back, but didn't quite succeed. You feel all right, Miss Eloise? The girl asked. Yes, Hetty, Eloise replied. Just a little out of sorts. Oh, I understand, said Hetty. Mr. Clayton White and you don't get along well, ma'am? No, Eloise admitted. I'm afraid not. Well, he isn't best company to be around, Hetty said, her voice betraying a bit of anger. He wasn't really rude, Hetty argued Eloise. He just... Oh, I don't know. He always manages to make me feel so uncomfortable. It's those eyes. They're always laughing at me. And that smug expression on his face whenever he gets me flustered. Ugh. Well, Miss Eloise, Hetty said, he's probably just trying to get even with you for all the times you've got him all flustered. Eloise smiled. Well, she said, it doesn't really matter. I'll probably not see much of him after this. Mama understands the situation and thinks almost as ill of him as I do, so she's not likely to have him over again for a long time, even if he is such a good friend of Nate's. She paused a moment to reflect on the situation. I only wish that he and Nate weren't such good friends. One fishing trip together, and there they go. They've been thick as thieves ever since. Hetty laughed and said, Well, ma'am, I'd best get downstairs. Your aunt should be arriving in a few hours, and the missus asked me especially to take care of her things. Thank you for bringing the tea up, said Eloise. You're welcome, miss, Hetty said, and she left with a curtsy. As I'm sitting here reading, so they're on a plantation, but I don't remember what their situation was as far as, like, owning slaves. I feel like they didn't. I think that was actually a big point in the prequel. He inherited the property from his family, the colonel we're talking about, and he was feeling very morally conflicted because the community he grew up in had certain expectations of him, and his property needed the income from the materials that they were selling, but he also didn't feel like it was morally right to own people, and he was really not happy with that. So I think a main part of the conflict of the prequel was him actually choosing not to continue in that tradition. So I think a main part of that conflict was him like freeing all the slaves on his property, and then like offering them, I think he actually offered them all like positions as official workers and like to compensate them with money, which he lost a ton of money, and like there was a big uproar in the community, but he ended up like having some other people who like sympathized with him and who agreed with him in the community who kind of stood up for him, and there's a big to-do and lots of danger and stuff. And I think that's kind of where we are here in this book, like why they have servants instead of slaves. I think it's because they actually are all like they're paid positions. They actually chose to stay with the family. Okay, back to the teenage angsting. Eloise looked at the tray of tea things and smiled a little. She sat herself down to the table and poured herself a cup of steaming tea, but found that she really didn't want it that much at present. She decided, however, that her stomach needed something. After all, she had been so out of sorts after Clayton's visit that she hadn't eaten lunch, and in her condition, she needed something to strengthen her. Her thoughts traveled to her aunt. What would she bring with her this time? Another sickly-looking bonnet? Or perhaps she would give Eloise another ivory fan that looked like it hadn't been used since King Arthur rode with the Knights of the Round Table. Her worst fear was aunt would give her some monstrosity and then ask her to wear it on Sunday so that she could show her off. With her bad luck, aunt probably would, and it would probably ruin Eloise's reputation for fine taste in clothing. However, Eloise reasoned, better to lose my reputation than to hurt aunt's feelings. After all, people in this county are gracious. A little bad taste isn't all that drastic to one's repertoire. I don't think that's the word that I meant to use there. And the dress that I have planned for the Mannings' garden party on Friday, she said aloud to herself. will blow them all away with its style, taste, color, and fittingness to a party of this kind. Since she felt somewhat better with something in her stomach, Eloise went over to the dressing table and looked at herself a long time. Also, something I'm noticing is that, there's no physical descriptions of the main character in here, anywhere. I'm not sure why. I think because I already have had in my mind, that she looked like me. Okay, so she talks a lot about her clothes for, 100 words, 200 words maybe. She talks about a lot of clothes. That was also very important to me at the time, because I was a girly girl. I was into clothes, I was into the fashions. This is what will really kind of clue you into what the book probably would have looked like if I had actually finished writing it. The smile on her face faded slowly, though, as she thought harder upon the subject of Clayton White. She found him to be mildly handsome, relatively attractive, and possessive of a fair amount of charisma. But he always seemed so aloof, as if she weren't quite good enough for him. Of course, she didn't talk that much in public, unless it was to one with whom she felt comfortable, and young men were not that most comfortable for her to be around. So young Mr. White probably assumed that she didn't talk that much at home. At this thought, Eloise could not help but laugh, thinking of his mistake if he thought so. But again her smile faded as she thought deeper on the subject. Many young men had probably been disillusioned with her quietness and discomfort around them, she imagined. If only they could see her when she was truly at ease. She was a lot of fun then, and pretty and imaginative, and if only she could sparkle and laugh and talk with ease like she did when she wasn't in public. Sorry, I'm trying really hard not to laugh at poor Joanna, poor 15-year-old Joanna, writing herself into a book. Eloise then turned her thoughts to all the young men she had met at her coming out party, back in the day. It was a coming out into society, where kind of it's a graduation type thing where you are now old enough to mingle with the adults. Most she had seen at church for nearly her entire life, but few had been introduced. There had been the fun and laughing, the shy and reserved, the comics, the braggarts, the daredevils, and the ones who made the young ladies melt by just walking by. Sorry, it's really hard not to laugh during this. Colonel Schirer's oldest son was one of the last mentioned. Though young, he made even the older girls blush. And then there were Mr. Fox's 3 sons. The youngest was a little too young for Eloise, but the second was just her age. He was the fun and laughing. Though far from being as good-looking as the young Shirer boy, he was fairly handsome. Eloise sighed. She wished that any of them would have even so much as sent a glance in her direction. Then she sharply reprimanded herself for worrying so much about the opinions of a few boys. Why should it matter so much? It wasn't as if she could marry all of them. Also, I'm not sure why, but, everyone's character or everyone's father was, connected to the military somehow. I'm not sure why. I think because as a 15-year-old, I wasn't really thinking about world building. They were all in the military, but just faster. They were all going to be able to fight in the war later. The noise of wagon wheels brought her abruptly out of her thoughts. Looking out the window, Eloise saw a carriage coming up the driveway. She was neither surprised nor alarmed at this, expecting her aunt to quit the carriage. But she had to look twice when it came to a smooth halt at the doorway of the house, and out stepped a young man. Again, options. Not recognizing him, Eloise looked closer, only to see the man assisting her own aunt out of the carriage. Eloise watched, assuming the young man was only there to help move Aunt Linnell, but as her aunt went into the house, the young man followed her. Eloise quickly took off her somewhat wrinkled afternoon gown, and threw on a brown print with plenty of frills, and then hurried to her dressing table to do something with her hair. The curls had straightened out a bit from neglect and were tangled, but Eloise swiftly arranged them in a mass on her head that looked somewhat neater and more fashionable. She then gave herself a quick powdering and a touch of scent, and hurried out of the room to see what was going on. I'm guessing a touch of scent is perfume. That just sounds weird. I don't know why I used that phrase. At the end of the hall, she checked her speed to a simple, carefree walk and approached the stairs. The young man was standing in the foyer downstairs beside Aunt Linnell, who was talking fast as she always did, and Genevieve stood with Rebecca and Marietta just opposite them. So Genevieve is the older sister, and Rebecca and Marietta, I think, are the 2 sisters under her. I can't remember. I think there was another one under her, too, that was older. Eloise did not see her mother, so she assumed that she had not yet been awakened. As for the young man, he did not seem upset to let Aunt Linnell handle the conversation. Eloise wondered if his opinion would change when the matchmaking began. However, it seemed as if Eloise were a little bit late to hear his name. She could just barely hear Aunt Linnell saying, in a speed that matched a chipmunk's, "Isn't that kind of him? I've always said I knew a good man when I saw one, and now I've brought one for your girls. Any one of you will do for him. Or rather, I should say he will do for any one of you, at least for any of the younger girls. It seems I'm too late to do anything for the oldest." And here she let out a laugh that was almost painful to hear, while Genevieve blushed in embarrassment, wanting to say something in her own defense, but too polite to be rude. and the young man twisted his hat in his hands, most uncomfortable with the way Aunt Linnell was handling the situation. I think that Aunt Linnell was inspired by Mrs. Bennet. Our family was also going through a Regency-era craze with all the Jane Austen movies. I was very big into Pride and Prejudice especially. A character or two from those movies would always pop in, and I think that this character is supposed to be similar to Mrs. Bennet. Deciding to save her sister's embarrassment at the risk of her own, Eloise came down the stairs at a moderate pace and said, "Why, Aunt Linnell, how good it is to see you again." "My dear Eloise," her aunt replied, "here we are. Where have you been? I want you to meet him too, you know." Without a pause for breath, her aunt continued, "Eloise, I want you to meet Logan Travers, my best friend's youngest son. Well, in fact, he's her only son. Well, her only biological son. She's got 4 sons-in-law, which is what Charlotte could use some of. What? Ha ha ha," she laughed again. So the conversation goes on for a while. Eloise ignored her aunt's forward manner and smiled at the young man, offering her hand with a curtsy. He took it and gave a beautiful bow, and before her aunt could begin the matchmaking procedure, Eloise said, in her most grown-up hostess voice, "Are you to stay with us, Mr. Travers?" The young man smiled and looked as though he would have replied, but Aunt Linnell cut him off with a hasty jocular, "Why, of course, dear. You wouldn't let such an eligible young man get away so quickly, would you? Especially since I went all the trouble of importing him all the way from Charleston." Genevieve took Eloise's hint and smiled, replying in a dignified manner, "Well, since you will, I'll call a servant to see your bags and take you to your rooms. You must both be tired from a long ride, and dinner should be a while yet, so please take as much time as you like." "I'll go and tell Mother you're here," Eloise offered. Yeah, so you can tell that there's not really a whole lot of actual conflict in the story yet. I think I actually didn't get to the main conflict of the book in the parts that I actually wrote, so that's kind of sad. They talk a little bit more. Stuff happens. They have dinner that night, and they get to, they see him a little bit more, and Aunt Linnell talks more. And then she describes him, like he's very Italian looking, he's got a very tan complexion. They go on through and make it to the next chapter. And once again, we have a description of, how sick she is from things, and I'm not sure, again, why I felt necessary to put that in there. So we skip all that. Basically, she couldn't make it to church. Now we skip over to one of my favorite points of view of the entire series, and that is her older brother, Nathaniel. Nathaniel is 17 years old in the story, when the story starts. And he is one of the most intriguing characters to me because he is the son of a very well-established, high-respected, and honorable military colonel from the South, whose older brothers are all big into the military as well, for the South. And he is conflicted because there's a part of him that feels like he should be true to his homeland and his family, and there's a part of him that really does not believe in much of anything that the South stands for, and wants to join the Union as far as if it were to come to war. And his story weaves throughout the entire series, and again, it's one of the ones that I find the most intriguing as an author. I wish that I had written through the course of the whole series so that I could actually get to see his story enacted in the book. That afternoon, the real rain began. Water poured from the sky in torrents so thick you could hardly see a few feet in front of you. When the wind howled and the rain fell, while the wind howled and the rain fell, Nathaniel watched it from his bedroom window, his mind far away from where he was. The happiness of his family at the present was drowned by the uncertainty of the future. Rumors were being spread, stories in the gossiping country town about war between the southern states and the Union. Nathaniel had not known real war like his father and grandfather before him had, and it frightened him. What would happen to his family, to Aldenwood, to the beautiful state of South Carolina if all the rumors were true? If the North and South really did make war upon each other? Make war upon each other? That just sounds weird. All of the battles that Nathaniel had read about were bloody, gruesome affairs. Nathaniel was not afraid of the sight of blood. He had gutted many a rabbit, skinned many a deer, and even tended to a hideous gash in Brandon's arm when they had been out hunting. But he had never seen anything like what he had read about. What would his father do when the war began? Would he request to be sent back into active duty again? Would he fight for the place he was born? Or would he refuse to take up arms against men he had dutifully fought beside, and against the country his grandfather had fought to free? And if his father did decide to join the army, what would become of Nathaniel? Patrick was already a lieutenant in the army, and Brandon was quickly working his way up. Nathaniel was only 17, but he had planned on living a normal life without entering the army, even though at this point in the story, normal is the military for, every guy in the whole thing. What was he to do now? Would he, too, be forced to pick up a sword? To protect his family, he would do anything, but he was not sure if he agreed with everything the Confederacy stood for. The sound of soft footsteps behind him brought Nathaniel back into the present, and he turned to see the sweet face of little Constance peeping through the doorway. He smiled at her, and she smiled in return, her bright blue eyes sparkling. She seemed hesitant to come in, so he knelt down and opened his arms to her. With a sudden impulsive giggle, the child ran over and threw herself into her brother's arms. He picked her up and swung her around as he had done so many times, and laughed, burying his face in the golden curls that tumbled over her shoulders. She giggled in response and pulled away to look him in the eyes. "What can I do for you, Connie?" Nathaniel asked. For a moment the child said nothing, and then her smile faded and a look of concern crossed her young face. "Ella." That's Eloise. Nathaniel waited, knowing that the girl often took a few moments to find the right words to express herself. "Ella's not upstairs." Nathaniel nodded his head. "She's not downstairs either." "I believe that Ella's in her room," her brother said. "Why?" asked Constance. "Did I do something to make her mad?" Nathaniel laughed, though he made sure she could tell he was not laughing at her. "I don't think you could do anything to make her mad, Constance," he said. "She's just not feeling well." "Is she sick?" the girl asked. "That's what I hear," Nathaniel replied. "Then," Constance declared, "I will paint her a picture of the sunshine. She loves the sunshine, and she can't see it today." "She would love that," said Nathaniel, and he squeezed the girl tight before setting her on the ground. Constance stretched her neck up as far as she could and gently kissed her big brother on the cheek, and then she hurried out of the room, being careful to close the door behind her. Just before she disappeared, she threw her brother a smile. Nathaniel smiled in return, but in his mind he frowned. If there was a war, what would become of Constance? She was the dearest, sweetest little girl on the planet, and she was so innocent, ever polite but always sincere, never failing to be kind but never afraid to be honest, loving and caring for anyone and everyone, and so very quick to forgive and forget. That was his sister, and he loved her greatly. What would he do if he were to lose her? So that's the end of our introduction to Nathaniel's point of view. Kind of get where his story goes. He's a little bit on the broody side too right now. And we transfer into the next chapter, which is back again to Eloise's standpoint. So the next chapter is a couple of days later, I guess. The ladies of the house have all gone, except for Eloise. And Aunt Linnell is with them too, and so she's kind of Eloise is taking the time to just enjoy peace and quiet because they have that talkative aunt staying with them. So she was bored. She put down her embroidery that she was working on and went to the library, the home library, to get a book. And this scene, I don't think I'm going to read because honestly, it's kind of boring. Most of this, honestly, is to other people, it is very boring. She ends up meeting Mr. Travers, Logan Travers, the guy that's staying with them. He's in the library reading a book by the fireplace. He jumps up when he sees Eloise, and she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," and then he actually talks to her. And he's reading a volume containing information on the progressive medical discoveries of Dr. L.G. Morehouse. Basically, he is training to become a doctor, a surgeon. To talk about how bad the medical profession is, he expresses an interest in bettering it. And it seems not important at this point in the story, but it does come in handy. They have their conversation, and we learn a little bit about Logan Travers, and then we move on to a party scene. Because in my mind, at 15 years old, if it was a historical drama, 90% of the story was going to be parties and ball gowns and all that kind of fun stuff. We get introduced to her two best friends, Eloise's two best friends, Grace Haywood, Nettie Fryer, and then Helen Pride, I think is, I don't know if she's like a friend or like a frenemy type character. And then Eloise basically says that she has this vow that she's going to be as polite to Clayton as possible. Basically, she wants to kind of prove herself to him through their conversation. Talks about her dress, talks about them riding up in the carriage, and then Aunt Linnell being goofy, and Eloise sees Clayton. As for Eloise, she quickly spied Clayton White on the other side of the lawn as he stood talking with Nettie Fryer. He saw her and looked at her a moment, and she smiled and nodded her head to him, and then looked the other way, holding her head high but trying to look demure. Rebecca giggled, having had the situation fully explained to her, and poked Marietta to look. Marietta saw but did not say anything. She was too busy watching Aunt Linnell and wondering if she might somehow distract her from the embarrassing greetings. There's more of that goes on with Aunt Linnell. Basically, Eloise talks with her friends and all that other stuff. She finally sees Clayton at the punch table. Clayton was on the other side of the table getting some punch with Joshua Shirer. According to laws of etiquette, he had to speak to her first on such an occasion. I don't remember if that's actually according to the laws of etiquette, but I thought it was at 15. and for a moment she feared he wouldn't. But then he saw her and said, "Well, Miss Eloise, I'm glad to see you're feeling better." "Thank you, Mr. White," Eloise replied, with the prettiest smile she could give. She would have continued, but he walked away with his punch and continued his conversation with Joshua. Eloise's face betrayed her disappointment, and Grace noticed it quickly. However, she said nothing until they had left the table, Eloise rather upset. "You were hoping for a conversation with Mr. White?" Grace said, taking her friend's arm again. Eloise sighed. "I was hoping that I would have had an opportunity to practice Genevieve's advice." "Well, maybe he'll talk to you later. After all, he was in a conversation with Mr. Shirer first, you know." "I know," said Eloise. "Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm simply dying to know how you've been. You must tell me everything that happened since I last saw you." So then we switch points of view again, and I'm not actually sure whose point of view. I think this is like a third-person omniscient, and it goes over to a group of the dudes standing around talking about what's happening, like whether or not they're going to go to war or not, and there's some friction, and there's some big discussion, and basically Eloise's dad, Colonel Ryerson, intimates that, he would never betray the South, but he would understand if someone felt like they couldn't fight for the South, and he gets hammered on for that. And then Clayton, okay, I guess this part is, this is the next scene, sorry. And also Colonel Bailey, who's the guy that Genevieve ends up marrying, talk. And then we skip over to another point of view, again, it's third-person omniscient, to where Nathaniel and Logan Travers are talking with Jesse Fox. He's one of the three sons that she was talking about before, Clayton White and Joshua Shirer. And I'm actually going to read their conversation because it's kind of important. Clayton and Nathaniel and a couple of the other characters here are kind of important. On the other side of the lawn, Nathaniel and Mr. Travers stood talking with Jesse Fox, Clayton White, and Joshua Shirer. "Well, what are we supposed to do about it?" Joshua was asking. "I know what I'm going to do about it," said Clayton with confidence. "If this really does turn into a full-fledged war, I'm enlisting." "For which army?" Jesse said. Clayton gave him a look of exasperation and told him the Confederate Army. "I don't think that probably would have been a joke back then." "It seems the only thing any of us could do without being shamed," said Nathaniel. "You wouldn't defend your family?" Clayton asked in astonishment. "Of course I would," Nathaniel hastily assured his friend. "It is only that if I had the choice, I would just leave the territory and go somewhere that is peaceful." "Well, that's what my father is starting to do already," said Joshua, looking down and kicking at the weeds. "He says that he's tired of war and wants to go where he won't have to kill anyone." "I'm not sure I can agree with that thinking," Clayton declared. Joshua's head jerked up and his face became defiant. With a defensive tone, he retorted, "How would you know about it? You've never been afraid of anything, but my father has been through battles before. He knows what he's talking about. And if he decides to move to where he's not required to fight against his own countrymen, I agree with him to the full." "I didn't mean... I'm sorry," said Clayton. "I just don't understand it." "Well, just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's wrong," Joshua argued, still defensive. "We must each know what we believe and hold to it," said Nathaniel. "Clayton, I'm glad you decided to enlist, but this war is different from all the others our nation has fought before. And," he added to Joshua, "if some wish not to be a part of it, I can completely understand why." Joshua returned his friend's gaze and nodded his head to him. Then he excused himself from the small party and left. That kind of gives, I guess, was meant to be some foreshadowing about what this group of friends was going to do during the war. And all of those points of view, which I'm not sure why Logan didn't talk. I think he was supposed to, and I edited it, and I never edited it. But Nathaniel's point of view there is important. Clayton's view is important because it shows, I think almost all of them end up having a point of view scene, at least one scene later on in the books. And this was kind of like the prep scene for all of that, and I'm not sure we actually get back to them. So then we go back, the next chapter, to Eloise lying on her bed and sighing, and teenage angsting again, talking about her disappointment. So her big plan to prove herself and make herself feel better to Clayton White went completely awry or whatever, because she didn't even actually talk to him other than the one time. And then she's been upset at Aunt Linnell, and all of her crazy matchmaking that doesn't actually seem to work. And then Genevieve comes in, and they have a really brief, not important discussion. But we do get a little hint of something that is a little bit important. I'm just going to throw this in real fast. "At least you have admirers," Eloise said, flopping down on the bed, giving a sigh. More sighing. The angst in this is just... I don't seem to have any in stock." "Don't be so coy," Genevieve whispered. "I saw Jesse Fox look over at you at least 5 times this afternoon." "I didn't see him. Where was he?" "We arrived late and left early," said Genevieve, "and then he was much tied up with other guests. But if he had had the chance, I feel certain that he would have spoken to you." "Well, it doesn't really matter," Eloise said decidedly. "Mother assures me that I'll have my share of admirers at my coming out. I guess that I changed the story here, and she hasn't had her coming out party yet. Well, we'll see." So then they talk some more, and for no reason, they don't really talk. And then she goes away. So they have a pretty good relationship. But that little bit of information is very important because of what I didn't actually ever get around to writing. Jesse Fox's character. At this point we changed to Rebecca, who is a 12-year-old. She's a 12-year-old sister. She hated Charlotte when Charlotte first came to marry her father, but she's gotten over that now, and she's just like Miss Energy and overbearing and like just blah. She's just there. She's just in everybody's face. And she actually had a bit more story, I think, in the second book and the third book as well, as she kind of grows up. So the next morning is Sunday. They all go to church. They meet up with some friends. And basically, I just go through in this chapter and talk about all the people in town. I'm not sure why I felt that was important. I think that was like what I had seen in a lot of books where they talk about everybody in the whole town. She sees Jesse Fox and thinks about him. She sees Clayton and thinks about him. And then she talks with a whole bunch of people, and her friends, and they really don't say anything of importance, except that Grace and Nathaniel kind of make eyes at each other. So Grace is Eloise's best friend. Nathaniel is older brother. They kind of make eyes at each other across the distance. That's important to remember. And they talk. And then, once again, she's not getting a chance to prove herself to Clayton. And she says, oh, well, at the end of the chapter, she thought to herself, I can talk to Clayton some other time. And then this is where we get to where the narrative ends. And the rest of the story is actually the interesting part. There's like a little blip of story from the little brother's point of view. I'm not sure why I had so many points of view. It's like I had everybody's point of view. If I had ever finished this book, a little in the series, it would have been so freaking long. So that's where the narrative ends as far as like me actually writing it. And but like I said, I knew the story forever. Like I always knew how the story was going to end. So I'm going to talk about that just a little bit and kind of just say where the story went and how it ended. Because cheesy writing, all the cheesy writing aside, and all the laughing at the cheesy writing aside, there was a story and there was some conflict. And I think for a 15-year-old, it wasn't too bad. Okay, so the rest of book 1 sort of follows the weeks leading up to the war and the amount of conflict surrounding the fight at Fort Sumter when everything finally breaks out. But from Eloise's, and we get most of that also from the surrounding points of view. Eloise's point of view is mostly like her romantic conflicts as a 15-year-old. So I think that she actually I can't remember if she turns 16 or not. I thought she might. But as the weeks progress, she still is trying to impress Clayton White, and he's not giving her the time of day. Well, Jesse Fox just all of a sudden starts talking to her. And he's not super good looking, but he's so nice, and she's just like, okay, I'll give him a chance. And she starts talking with him, and pretty soon, she kind of falls in like with him, not like a deep love, but like she really likes him. He's a really nice guy, and she'd be okay with being married to him in her little 15-year-old mind. Well, the war breaks out, and that's when everything goes haywire, and Jesse has finally decided he's going to join the Confederate Army, and he comes to her last minute and says, would you marry me? And she freaks out, because she's 15, and a 15-year-old me didn't think that was a problem. So she freaks out, but ends up, and somehow I had this justified, like, in my mind. But she finally ends up saying yes. So in her immaturity, she goes ahead, and they end up getting married, like, I think a couple of months later. Like, he goes off to training, and then is allowed, like, 1 weekend home or something before he's sent out. I don't even know. Like, at the time of writing this, I had no idea how the military worked, let alone in the 1800s. So I'm not even sure, like, how much of this story that I had in my head would actually have worked. But basically, he comes home just long enough to get married, and they spend a magical weekend together, and then he goes off to war. And he leaves behind, like, this big stack of letters. Because he realizes, mail's not going to get through, because we're in the middle of war. So he leaves her a huge stack of letters to open while he's gone. And she opens the first one. So, like, he leaves. This is the very end of the book, by the way. The first book ends this way. She opens the first letter, and she realizes that he had started writing these letters to her when he was 14, and now he's 17, or 18. Now he's 18. And she's 15. He's been in love with her since they were young. and she had no clue. And he's been writing her these letters. And I'm not really sure how I feel about that plot point now that I'm older, because it feels kind of slightly creepy, but also not, because I mean, it's I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that, because it's kind of like a weird plot point. But that's how the first book ends, is they've gotten married. It's like a whirlwind where all of a sudden she's at home and she's married and her husband's gone and has left her all these letters, and she realizes that he's been in love with her forever. And that's kind of where the book ends. So book 2 picks up, I think, a couple months maybe after, I think it's like a couple weeks after book 1 leaves off. And we start off with, again, Eloise's perspective. And once again, her whirlwind, all of a sudden whirlwind life that went from 0 to 60 in all of 3 weeks has caught up with her as she realizes that she's pregnant. She's a little bit freaked out. Everybody's a little bit freaked out by this news. And so that's kind of, the second book didn't have a ton of material figured out. I'm just going to be flat out honest with that. There was a lot of points of view. I think during the second book we saw the most of the conflict happen with Nathaniel. So, which is where all of that stuff from the first book kind of comes into play. So Nathaniel has basically been pressured at this point. He turned 18. He's been pressured at this point to join the Confederate Army. He feels like it's his duty. He has no way out of it, even though he does not want to. He literally has no choice, at least in his own mind. So he goes up and he joins with Jesse Fox and Clayton White. They all go in together, and I can't remember exactly what happened to Joshua Shirer, the guy that wanted to leave. I can't remember exactly. I think that like his family tried to leave, and then they got like ambushed by people who wanted them, like who thought they were traitors, and then they all ended up dying. I don't remember. It was very dramatic, whatever it was. I know a lot of crap like that did happen back then, so maybe it was realistic too. So Nathaniel's point of view comes through. Nathaniel is struggling with this whole thing, and he is trying to figure out a way to get out of this, because he cannot, in good conscience, fight for something he doesn't believe in. But he feels like he has no way out, and now he's allowed himself to be pressured into actually joining this army, so he doesn't know what he's doing. So he gets deployed. I can't remember where. I think he's part of the group that actually like ends up being very near Washington. And in essence, he fakes his own death. He tells Jesse, I think, and he fakes his death on the battlefield so that he can get away. He ends up sneaking across the Union lines and giving himself up and saying, I was pressured into this and I need to be allowed to do this. Naturally, they don't believe him right away. He gets put through a lot of crap. But finally, an intelligence officer comes to him and says, we could really use a spy. And, if you really know, your father's Colonel Ryerson, then you know all the ins and outs of this, isn't this? Because I guess the colonel was like a big part of the military. And we could really use your services. Would you like to be a part of this? This is like the way that you could prove yourself. So that's his part of book 2, and it really like fills up a large chunk of book 2. Genevieve ends up getting officially engaged before her soon-to-be husband goes away. And somehow, somewhere in the book, they end up getting rush married to, like, he makes it back for some reason, or she goes up there or something, but she ends up getting married. Maybe they got married in book 1. I don't remember. Married. And her husband, Sergeant Bailey, ends up dying, like, within months of them getting married. Like, he's one of the first people that gets killed. And it's traumatizing for the entire family. Eloise freaks out because not only is she now, like, a teenage pregnant wife, but her sister's husband just died, and she's, like, broken with the reality that this could happen to anybody. So that's Genevieve's part of the story, and then Rebecca goes through some crap, and then Colonel Ryerson decides, I think about 3/4 of the way through the book, to go back in active service and actually be a part of the military, other than just, like, his expertise and advising skills. So a lot of drama going on for everybody. And we see a lot about Clayton White and Jesse through other points of view in the story. I think Jesse and Eloise actually do end up getting to write back and forth some. And basically Jesse and Clayton start having issues with each other. And it's seemingly all Clayton, and it's becoming a real problem. And basically at some point, Clayton just, like, he ends up getting himself assigned to a different unit or something. I'm not sure for that. Again, 15-year-old me was writing at this point, so I have no idea if that's even possible, but that's what happened in the story. So there's all that drama. And then Eloise ends up coming to the end of her pregnancy. And, of course, freaking out the whole time. And it turns out to be twins, a boy and a girl. The twins are, the boy's name is Nathaniel. She named him for her brother because they all think he's dead at this point. And she named the girl Miriam Charlotte. So Charlotte is the middle name after Charlotte. But then her first name is Miriam. So they have Nathaniel and Miriam. So she gives birth to twins. I think it's like 2/3 the way through the book, or 3/4. And is freaking out because now she's trying to be a mother without a husband. You know, people that they know and love keep getting killed in the battlefront. And it's traumatizing. And she doesn't know how she's going to cope with it. And she's finally starting to come to terms with it toward the end of the book. And Jesse gets sent home because he had an injury that led to a fatal illness. They know they can't cure him. They know he's going to die. They just don't know when. So basically, they sent him home to die. So he goes home, and she hasn't seen him, like, in a year. Or a year and a half, I think, at this point. She's already had his kids. They've only spent one weekend together as a married couple at all. She barely knew him when she married him, except through these letters that she's been reading, which is actually, that part was kind of sweet. Like, she gets to read some letters and get to know him, but it's still kind of sad and awkward and weird all at the same time. He comes home, and they spend, I think, like a month or 2 months together before he passes away. And so he gets to know his kids before he dies, and it's just very sad. I don't know why I wrote it like this. It was a very dramatic and traumatizing story, but that's what I wrote, or I was planning on writing. And the book ends where Eloise finally has come to terms with this war, or thinks she's come to terms with this war. And she makes this great, big, Scarlett O'Hara decision that she's going to survive and everything's going to be okay in the end. Or maybe it's Jesse's home. Maybe she moved into Jesse's home because his family isn't there anymore. And she inherited it when he died. Not inherited, but like got it from him when he died. She determines to turn his house, his big mansion, into a hospital of sorts for wounded war veterans. I'm not sure how that would have worked. Like, I'm not a Civil War buff. I should have been, probably, if I was going to be writing this. But somehow her decision in the end is to turn this house into a military recovery place of sorts, like a hospital for the wounded. That's how book 2 ends. 15-year-old me had issues. Alright, so we move on to book 3. This is the end of the saga. I don't remember even how it starts. But the key events are from the other points of view. We still get Nathaniel's point of view as he is working with the Union. Everybody thinks he's dead. We get everybody else's point of view in the whole world, basically. But the only events that I remember in book 3 of being of any significance is Eloise's plotline. And hers is not super exciting, but I think it has more excitement probably than the first 2 combined for her. So let's see if we can get through this here. We're almost to the end, people. We're almost to the end. So she's turned the house into this hospital, and wounded soldiers are being sent in, and she's set it all up, and it's going smoothly. And there's lots of other stuff and crap that's happening all around. But the big problem hits when there's this northern officer that gets sent to the hospital. I think his injury was so severe that like they didn't want to send him to a prisoner of war camp. They wanted to send him to the hospital first. So, and she promises that like she'll make sure that he doesn't go anywhere. So she's watching him, and he's very, very nice, very kind, very polite. Well, guess who shows up on her doorstep as slightly injured, just injured enough he can't be sent off into battle, but still good enough to be part of the guard. So he's guarding all the prisoners that are coming here to get protected or to get treated after their injuries. Clayton White! Who knew, right? So he shows up and is a big jerk to her. And is just like all bitter and all angry and all just like, he's just mean. He's just mean for the sake of being mean to her. And she kind of ends up breaking through his barriers a little bit. He's especially pissed off that she's being so nice to this northerner. He, I think at one point, like, talks about, maybe we should just let him go. And by letting him go, obviously, like, let him die, because he's like, we'd kill him on the battlefield. How is it any different in the hospital? He's just not right in the head. And she's like, fine, whatever, just go do your thing and I'll go do mine. So she's taking care of her growing up kids. And then there's like an attack of some kind on the house, and the northern officer actually, like, the guys that come in, they are northern, but they're like jerk faces, and they're doing all these horrible things, and the northern officer actually steps in and saves Eloise's life. Although after she had been a total badass and, like, tried to, killed an officer, like, she fought for herself pretty well. But he ends up stepping in and saving her life. So after that, Clayton's kind of like, okay, maybe I'm being just stupid right now. So he and Eloise end up having a heart-to-heart of sorts. Like, Clayton's pretty much a, hard heart right now. But she is completely open and honest with him about Jesse and about how she actually felt about him, about what it was like having his kids without him there, without even really knowing who he was, and then having him come home and feeling like they just had barely gotten to know each other when he passed away. And Clayton, you can see he's starting to melt a little bit, but he still won't melt all the way. So they talk a lot about before the war and what might come after. And next morning, he's gone. He took his group or whatever, and they've gone back, and he left a letter for her. Can you tell letters were like a theme for me? So she reads the letter, and basically Clayton says in the letter, I don't want to say this to you in person because I was just too embarrassed. I don't know how to say it. Like, I don't know how to talk to people in real life, basically, is what he says. I always felt like if I acted like I was confident, maybe somehow I actually would gain some confidence, that I would actually feel secure in who I was. And he expresses that, he did express in the conversation before he felt guilty, like it was his fault that Jesse died, but he wouldn't tell her why. And in the letter he explains, he had always liked Eloise. Clayton had. But he was trying to win her by acting like he was better than her and getting her to, like, look up to him and respect him, and playing hard to get. And then Jesse swooped in and got her, and Clayton was like, what? And so that's why he and Jesse had issues, and then other crap was happening with the war and with the horrors of what they saw, and it just turned him. And so he basically feels like when he asked to be transitioned, to a different, when he asked to be transferred to a different unit, he felt like he betrayed Jesse, like he abandoned him, like if he had been there, maybe Jesse wouldn't have died. It was very traumatizing him when he found out that Jesse died. Then when he came there and saw her, it was just like it started everything all over again in his heart, and he just didn't know how to handle it. Right before he goes back to war, so yeah, like no confused emotions there. So that's like, I would say like a halfway through the book point, with all the other stuff that's being talked about on the other points of view, and somehow they make it all the way to the end of the war by then. Like, they just time jump or something, I don't know. Second half of the book, not a whole lot happens that I can remember. There isn't, other than Nathaniel and, like, Eloise struggling through life and surviving. There really isn't much of a central conflict in any of these books. It's just kind of a list of happenings. So the war ends, and we see all of who lived and who didn't, and we see all the new couples and all the new stuff, because, again, 15. And so Clayton comes home, and they talk. I think that they actually, like, she sent him a letter, like, rushed a letter out to him before he got all the way to the front lines, basically saying that she understood, and if he ever wanted to give it another try, if he got back, if they want to give it a try, she'd be up for it. So when he gets back, it's like this sweet reunion where they don't actually, like, say, oh, we're going to get married now, but it's like, we're going to start working toward that, She's already got 2 kids. He's healing emotionally and physically from this traumatizing war. So basically it's like, we'll go slow at this thing. But it's like they're going to be together, and you know that they're going to end up together, so it's kind of sweet. It's kind of sweet. Looking back at it now, I'm wondering how cheesy, is too cheesy, but I think at this point we're just going to call this series a romance series and end it there. Although it doesn't end there, of course, because Nathaniel still has his story going on. Basically, he can't come home because he committed treason against the South. He would never be allowed back in his hometown. So he decides to go west. And he sends a letter to his family explaining what happened, saying, this is why I can't come home. This is why I lied to you. I'm so sorry for breaking your hearts. I hope that you'll be able to forgive me someday. And then when, of course, it's a shock to everybody, and this happens before Clayton comes back. It's a shock to everybody. The community quickly finds out about it. Gossip spreads like wildfire, and Grace Haywood, his old flame, Eloise's best friend, finds out about it. We find out in book 2, I think, that she and Nathaniel were actually very close to starting to court before he got pushed into leaving so soon. And So when she finds out what's happened, at this point she's like, I've seen enough marriages be torn apart by war and enough people, just all of a sudden be gone out of your life. I'm not taking that chance with this. So she ends up with her, surprisingly, her family's permission. Her family's okay with it. The community's not, but her family's okay with it. She goes after him. She joins him, and they go west, and, supposedly they're never heard from again by the family. They get to ride off in the sunset. Genevieve, I think, ends up getting remarried. The Colonel Ryerson, of course, he comes home. Rebecca actually ends up joining Grace to go west. I don't remember why. I think it's like she just was so disillusioned with everything that had happened that she was just ready to be gone. So she kind of left. Again, not sure if that would even happen, but I was 15, so anything was possible. And that's kind of where the story ends. It ends on a romantic note. It ends with everything could be happily ever after. But before it quite gets to happily ever after, again, there really was not one central conflict to this story. I didn't know anything about plotting. I barely knew how to put a story together despite how long I had been writing when I came up with the story. But the characters, like I said, they were in my head for years, even though I never finished writing them. And so I felt like they were a part of me. And Eloise was me. She was the teenage me, albeit a little bit more assertive and self-confident than me. As cheesy as it is, and as very odd as the writing is, very Charles Dickens-ish as the writing was, I still love this story. And I had wanted for years to go back and salvage it, change a lot of stuff. It was just too much work. And especially with all the other stories that I have going on in my fantasy worlds and how much work those were going to take, I was like, there's some other historical fictions that are actually I love even more and that I'm more interested in writing, and so this one is going to be put on the shelf from here on after. Eloise Ryerson will be nothing more than a fond memory and something to both cherish and laugh at, if that makes sense. I love this chance just to look back at my teenage writing and realize just wow. I'm not even sure what my own reaction is to this. There's a part of me that's for 15, that's not terrible. That could have been worse. And there's another part of me that's oh, but still, even so. So tell me something down in the comments. What did you write when you were 15? What were some of the cringy but kind of cool stories that you came up with as a teenager? Did you insert yourself into the story? Or did you write about people as far different from you as possible? Just tell me in the comments. What kind of stuff did you do as a teenager, as a writer? Also, side note, if you're a teenage writer watching this video, this is why we don't publish until we grow up a little bit more. Because if this was a published book, if this was a published series, I would be so humiliated right now. Because, again, it wasn't terrible for 15. But, so all this to say, don't go out and pop a book on the internet until you're old enough. And there's not really an age limit, but just people will tell you. Give it to an adult, have them read it, they'll tell you. Trust someone who's older than you if you are a teen writer. Alright everybody, well that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this kind of different video. Like I said, this is the first of a series of videos of me talking about some of these stories that I came up with as a teenager and as a young preteen that I will never be finishing writing, and so I just want to get them out there and talk about them and just have some fun. If you did enjoy it, of course be sure to like, and of course consider subscribing on the way out. I post regularly content every Saturday, mostly around fantasy series and a day in the life of a writer, that kind of stuff. All my social media links are in the description box below, as well as my website as an author and some other fun stuff you can check out. And yeah, as far as updates for Snow Dust, which is my book that will be coming out next year, it's going well. Beta reading starts day after tomorrow, so wish me luck. As always, I hope you have an amazing rest of the weekend writing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.